Process and Reality by Alfred North Whitehead. Quotes. In Process and Reality, Alfred North Whitehead presents his profound vision of a universe defined by change, creativity, and interconnection. This philosophical work offers an in-depth exploration of the fundamental nature of reality, challenging the classical notion of static being and emphasizing the processual character of existence. Whitehead's philosophy of organism asserts that all entities are deeply interconnected, and that reality itself is an ever-evolving process. Through his unique synthesis of metaphysics, science, and philosophy, Whitehead invites readers to re-envision the world not as a collection of isolated objects, but as a dynamic web of relationships shaped by creativity and purpose. Quote 1. Speculative philosophy is the endeavor to frame a coherent, logical, necessary system of general ideas in terms of which every element of our experience can be interpreted. Speculative philosophy is an attempt to create a unified and systematic understanding of reality by interpreting every experience as a specific example of a larger, coherent framework of ideas. The goal is to construct a system that is logically consistent and universally applicable, without leaving any experience outside its scope. Quote 2. Coherence, as here employed, means that the fundamental ideas, in terms of which the scheme is developed, presuppose each other so that in isolation they are meaningless. The concept of coherence implies that fundamental philosophical ideas depend on one another, meaning none of them can stand alone. This interdependence ensures that no aspect of experience can be fully understood without considering its relationship to the whole system. Quote 3. The true method of discovery is like the flight of an aeroplane. It starts from the ground of particular observation. It makes a flight in the thin air of imaginative generalization, and it again lands for renewed observation rendered acute by rational interpretation. Philosophical discovery involves moving between concrete observations and imaginative generalizations. Like an airplane taking off, it begins with specific experiences, soars into the realm of broader speculation, and then returns to examine those experiences with a fresh perspective informed by rational thought. Quote 4. There is no first principle which is in itself unknowable, not to be captured by a flash of insight. No philosophical principle is inherently beyond human understanding. With the right insight and effort, any fundamental concept can be grasped, though this may require a process of gradual refinement and imaginative interpretation. Quote 5. The success of the imaginative experiment is always to be tested by the applicability of its results beyond the restricted locus from which it originated. Philosophical generalizations are tested by how well they apply to experiences beyond the specific examples that inspired them. If an idea derived from one field of inquiry can be applied broadly, it indicates the success and value of that philosophical insight. Quote 6. Logical perfection does not here require any detailed explanation. An example of its importance is afforded by the role of mathematics in the restricted field of natural science. The standard of logical perfection, while important, can be understood by looking at mathematics, which shows how abstract, logically precise systems can later find broad and significant applications in the natural sciences. Quote 7. Incoherence is the arbitrary disconnection of first principles. Incoherence in a philosophical system arises when foundational ideas are arbitrarily separated from one another, leading to a failure in providing a unified understanding of reality. A system that does not integrate its principles coherently cannot adequately explain the interconnectedness of experiences. Quote 8. Philosophy never reverts to its old position after the shock of a great philosopher. Philosophy evolves continually. After the introduction of a powerful new idea by a major philosopher, the field can never fully return to its previous state. Each transformative insight permanently alters the trajectory of philosophical thought. Quote 9. The distinction between verbal phrases and complete propositions is one of the reasons why the logician's rigid alternative, true or false, is so largely irrelevant for the pursuit of knowledge. The pursuit of knowledge cannot be constrained by the simple binary of true or false, as often employed in logic. Words and phrases are ambiguous and incomplete in their expression of ideas, making it crucial to move beyond rigid categorizations in philosophical inquiry. Quote 10. Philosophy frees itself from the taint of ineffectiveness by its close relations with religion and with science, natural and sociological. Philosophy becomes truly effective when it merges with and influences both religion and science. It is through this fusion that philosophy gains practical relevance and can address both the emotional and intellectual needs of human experience. Quote 11. The useful function of philosophy is to promote the most general systematization of civilized thought. Philosophy's primary role is to create a comprehensive framework that organizes human thought, connecting specialized knowledge with common sense and imagination. This enables a deeper understanding of both specific phenomena and the broader complexities of existence. Quote 12. Actual entities, also termed actual occasions, are the final real things of which the world is made up. There is no going behind actual entities to find anything more real. Actual entities, or actual occasions, are the most fundamental units of reality, the building blocks of the universe. Everything in existence, from the most insignificant events to the divine, is composed of these entities. There is no deeper level of reality beyond these, and each entity represents a drop of experience. Quote 13. The final facts are, all alike, actual entities, and these actual entities are drops of experience, complex and interdependent. Every actual entity, regardless of its importance or role in the universe, is an experience, and they are all interconnected. The complexity of the universe is rooted in the intricate web of relationships between these entities, each contributing to the whole through their interactions. Quote 14. The ontological principle can be summarized as, no actual entity, then no reason. The ontological principle asserts that all explanations and reasons must be grounded in actual entities. In other words, the existence of reasons is inseparable from the existence of these entities. Without them, no reason or cause can be found. Quote 15. Creativity is the principle of novelty. An actual occasion is a novel entity diverse from any entity in the many which it unifies. Creativity is the driving force that introduces newness into the world. Each actual occasion represents a unique and new synthesis of pre-existing entities, embodying novelty that did not exist before the moment of its creation. Quote 16. The many become one and are increased by one. This phrase encapsulates the process of unity and creativity, where multiple entities come together to form a single new entity, which then becomes part of the larger multiplicity. Each act of becoming contributes something novel, increasing the overall diversity of the universe. Quote 17. How an actual entity becomes constitutes what that actual entity is, so that the two descriptions of an actual entity are not independent. Its being is constituted by its becoming. This is the principle of process. The nature of an actual entity is defined by the process through which it comes into existence. Its identity and characteristics are shaped by how it becomes, meaning that being and becoming are inseparable. This is central to Whitehead's process philosophy, where change and development are fundamental to existence. Quote 18. The concrescence of each individual actual entity is internally determined and is externally free. Each actual entity's process of becoming is shaped by its internal conditions, yet it remains free in how it responds to external influences. This dynamic between internal determination and external freedom highlights the balance between structure and agency in the unfolding of reality. Quote 19. No thinker thinks twice, and, to put the matter more generally, No subject experiences twice. Each experience or thought is entirely unique and cannot be repeated in the same way. This emphasizes the dynamic and ever-changing nature of reality, where every moment and every thought is a new occurrence, never to be exactly replicated. Quote 20. In the philosophy of organism, it is not substance which is permanent, but form. Forms suffer changing relations. Actual entities perpetually perish subjectively, but are immortal objectively. In process philosophy, permanence is found in forms, not substances. While actual entities constantly undergo change and perish subjectively, they leave behind an objective imprint that remains part of the world, thus achieving a form of immortality through their contributions to the ongoing process of reality. Quote 21. The primordial created fact is the unconditioned conceptual valuation of the entire multiplicity of eternal objects. This is the primordial nature of God. God's primordial nature is defined by a comprehensive valuation of all possible forms or eternal objects, without any restrictions. This aspect of God exists beyond time, and it is from this conceptual ordering that the relevance of eternal objects for actual entities is derived, grounding the potential for creation and change within the universe. Quote 22. Creativity is without a character of its own in exactly the same sense in which the Aristotelian matter is without a character of its own. Creativity, like Aristotelian matter, has no inherent characteristics. It is an abstract force or principle that enables the formation of novel entities by bringing together the diverse elements of the universe into new, unified actual occasions. This process is conditioned by the world, including the divine ordering, but creativity itself remains characterless. Quote 23. God's immanence in the world in respect to his primordial nature is an urge towards the future based upon an appetite in the present. God, in his primordial nature, influences the world by driving creation forward, an immanent force that works through an inherent desire or appetite in the present moment. This appetite is not random, but a conceptual valuation that pushes toward realizing potential futures, making God a key element in the continuous creative advance of the universe. Quote 24. There is a becoming of continuity, but no continuity of becoming. While the physical universe appears continuous, the process of becoming itself is not continuous. Instead, becoming happens in discrete moments or actual entities, which collectively create the appearance of continuity. Each actual entity is a distinct occasion of experience, contributing to the broader continuous fabric of reality. Quote 25. The ultimate metaphysical truth is atomism. The creatures are atomic. At the most fundamental level, reality is composed of individual, atomic entities. These entities are the basic units of existence, and the process of creation involves the emergence of these discrete, individual atoms of experience, rather than a smooth, uninterrupted flow. Quote 26. Actual entities perish, but do not change. They are what they are. Once an actual entity comes into being, it cannot change. It exists as a fixed reality and then perishes, contributing to the overall process of creation, but remaining immutable in its own existence. The entity's permanence is in its role in the past, even as it ceases to exist in the present. Quote 27. Each atom is a system of all things. Every actual entity, or atom, encompasses the entire universe within it, in the sense that it is related to all other things. This interconnectedness of all entities forms a unified system, with each individual atom reflecting the totality of existence in its own particular way. Quote 28. A society may, or may not, be analyzable into many strands of enduring objects. Societies, in Whitehead's philosophy, are collections of related actual entities. Some societies, like physical objects, may be made up of multiple strands of enduring objects, entities that maintain their defining characteristics over time. The analysis of these societies helps explain their persistence and change throughout time. Quote 29. Any instance of experience is dipolar, whether that instance be God or an actual occasion of the world. Every experience, whether it is a divine or worldly experience, has two aspects, a mental pole and a physical pole. These dual aspects are present in all instances of becoming, with God originating from the mental pole and actual entities of the world from the physical pole. Both poles are essential for the complete process of experience. Quote 30. The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. This quote emphasizes the lasting influence of Plato's ideas on European philosophy. Whitehead suggests that much of Western philosophical thought is a development or response to the fundamental concepts found in Plato's works, which continue to inspire and shape subsequent philosophies, including his own philosophy of organism. Quote 31. The things which are temporal arise by their participation in the things which are eternal. Whitehead explains that the temporal, ever-changing aspects of the world are rooted in and derive their existence from the eternal, unchanging forms or potentials. This connection between the temporal and eternal underscores the interaction between what is actual and what is possible, a central theme in process philosophy. Quote 32. The search for a reason is always the search for an actual fact, which is the vehicle of the reason. According to the ontological principle, reasons and explanations must always be tied to actual entities. There can be no abstract reasoning detached from real, concrete facts. This idea reinforces Whitehead's focus on the interrelation of the actual and the potential in understanding reality. Quote 33. An actual entity is a process and is not describable in terms of the morphology of a stuff. Whitehead highlights that actual entities are not static substances, but dynamic processes. This marks a shift from traditional metaphysical views that rely on the notion of fixed substances or materials, focusing instead on the becoming and development of actual entities through time. Quote 34. The process of becoming is dipolar, I, by reason of its qualification by the determinateness of the actual world, and T, by its conceptual prehensions of the indeterminateness of eternal objects. This quote refers to Whitehead's idea that each process of becoming has two poles, one influenced by the concrete, determined aspects of the actual world, and the other shaped by the potential, indeterminate possibilities offered by eternal objects. This duality reflects the interaction of the actual and the possible in the creative advance of reality. Quote 35. This is the doctrine of the emergent unity of the superject. An actual entity is to be conceived both as a subject presiding over its own immediacy of becoming and a superject, which is the atomic creature exercising its function of objective immortality. Whitehead explains that an actual entity, in its process of becoming, is both a subject experiencing its own formation and a superject, a complete entity that continues to exist as a datum for future entities. This dual role bridges the present, active process of becoming with the objective continuity of existence in the universe. Quote 36. Every actual entity, since it is what it is finally its own reason for what it omits. Once an actual entity completes its process of becoming, it becomes fully determined and definitive. What the entity does not include is excluded by necessity, as the entity is complete and cannot incorporate additional elements without changing its essential nature. Quote 37. The term Platonic form has here been used as the briefest way of indicating the entities in question. I use the phrase eternal object for what in the preceding paragraph of this section I have termed a Platonic form. Whitehead distinguishes between Platonic forms and what he refers to as eternal objects. These eternal objects are conceptual potentials that do not depend on any particular actual entities for their existence, and they represent the abstract possibilities that can be realized in the world. Quote 38. It is a contradiction in terms to assume that some explanatory fact can float into the actual world out of nonentity. Whitehead asserts that any explanatory fact must have a basis in actual reality. There can be no explanation or reason that arises from nothing. Every explanation must be rooted in something concrete and actual, affirming the importance of the ontological principle in his metaphysical framework. Quote 39. The doctrine is that each concrescence is to be referred to a definite free initiation and a definite free conclusion. This statement highlights the idea that every process of becoming or concrescence starts and ends with an element of freedom. The beginning of a process is influenced by the entire universe, while its conclusion is unique to the specific entity that emerges, reflecting its individual decisions and creative emphasis. Quote 40. The principle of universal relativity directly traverses Aristotle's dictum. A substance is not present in a subject. On the contrary, according to this principle, an actual entity is present in other actual entities. Whitehead challenges Aristotle's notion of substance by asserting that actual entities are inherently interconnected and present within one another. Rather than existing independently, each entity affects and is affected by others, reflecting the relational nature of reality in process philosophy. Quote 41. An actual entity is concrete because it is such a particular concrescence of the universe. The concreteness of an actual entity arises from its specific process of bringing together various elements of the universe into a unique, unified experience. This concrescence emphasizes the dynamic, interconnected formation of reality in each individual entity. Quote 42. Locke talks of understanding and perception. He should have started with a more general neutral term to express the synthetic concrescence, whereby the many things of the universe become the one actual entity. Whitehead critiques Locke's use of terms like understanding and perception for failing to capture the broader, more fundamental process by which an actual entity integrates diverse experiences. The term prehension is introduced to express this more comprehensive activity of an entity synthesizing its experience. Quote 43. The prehension of one actual entity by another actual entity is the complete transaction, analyzable into the objectification of the former entity as one of the data for the latter, and into the fully clothed feeling whereby the datum is absorbed into the subjective satisfaction. Whitehead explains prehension as the process by which one entity experiences another. This involves taking the other entity as a datum, absorbing it into the subject's experience, and creating a feeling that contributes to the entity's final satisfaction. Quote 44. The principle that I am adopting is that consciousness presupposes experience, and not experience consciousness. Consciousness, according to Whitehead, is not a prerequisite for experience but a specific aspect of it. Experience exists first, and consciousness may or may not emerge from that experience, which is a broader process of becoming that includes but is not limited to conscious awareness. Quote 45. Mental activity is one of the modes of feeling belonging to all actual entities in some degree, but only amounting to conscious intellectuality in some actual entities. Whitehead emphasizes that mental activity, or feeling, is a fundamental part of every actual entity. However, the level of conscious intellectuality varies, with only some entities reaching higher levels of conscious thought, while others experience more basic forms of feeling. Quote 46. The creative action is the universe always becoming one in a particular unity of self-experience, and thereby adding to the multiplicity, which is the universe as many. This statement encapsulates Whitehead's view of the universe as a continuous process of unifying various experiences into individual actual entities. Each act of becoming adds to the complexity and multiplicity of the universe, contributing to its ongoing creative advance. Quote 47. Locke misses one essential doctrine, namely that the doctrine of internal relations makes it impossible to attribute change to any actual entity. Whitehead points out that Locke overlooks the idea that an actual entity cannot change. Every entity is defined by its internal relations with other entities, and change refers not to the entity itself, but to the shifting relationships of eternal objects within the ongoing process of becoming. Quote 48. The perishing of absoluteness is the attainment of objective immortality. Whitehead describes how, when an actual entity completes its process of becoming, it perishes as a subject, but gains objective immortality. This means the entity remains as a permanent part of the world, contributing to the ongoing process of creation as an eternal fact in the universe. Quote 49. The doctrine of organism is the attempt to describe the world as a process of generation of individual actual entities, each with its own absolute self-attainment. Whitehead's philosophy of organism views the world as a continuous process of generating individual entities, each achieving its own unique realization. This self-attainment defines the concrete, individual nature of each entity, while contributing to the overall process of reality. Quote 50. Continuity concerns what is potential, whereas actuality is incurably atomic. Whitehead is clarifying the distinction between continuity and actuality. While continuity represents the potential for division and extension, the reality of the universe is made up of atomic, discrete entities. Actuality is composed of individual, irreducible events, or entities that cannot be divided further, marking the clear boundary between what is real and what is only potential. Quote 51. The contemporary world as perceived by the senses is the datum for contemporary actuality, and is therefore continuous, divisible, but not divided. The world as we perceive it presents a continuous field, which appears unbroken and seamless. However, this perception is only potential for division, and in reality, the world is composed of atomic entities. The continuity we experience is a potentiality, not the actual divided nature of reality. Quote 52. These possibilities of division constitute the external world a continuum. For a continuum is divisible. So far as the contemporary world is divided by actual entities, it is not a continuum, but is atomic. Whitehead describes how the external world appears as a continuum because of its potential for infinite division. Yet, the actual world is composed of distinct, indivisible entities. The world is only a continuum in the sense that it could be divided, but in actuality, it is made up of individual atoms or actual entities. Quote 53. The bare mathematical potentialities of the extensive continuum require an additional content in order to assume the role of real objects for the subject. This content is supplied by the eternal objects termed sense data. The mathematical potentialities of space and time, which exist as part of the extensive continuum, need something more to become part of our actual experience. This is provided by eternal objects like sense data, which give form and substance to the potentiality, turning it into something we can experience as real. Quote 54. An active experience has an objective scheme of extensive order by reason of the double fact that its own perspective standpoint has extensive content, and that the other actual entities are objectified with the retention of their extensive relationships. Whitehead explains that each act of experience is structured by both its own standpoint and the objectified relationships of other entities within the continuum. These relationships provide the framework for understanding how each individual experience fits into the broader extensive order of the universe. Quote 55. Actual entities atomize the extensive continuum. This continuum is in itself merely the potentiality for division. An actual entity affects this division. Actual entities divide the continuum, turning potentiality into actuality. While the continuum itself is only a potential for division, actual entities impose real boundaries, creating the distinctness and individualization necessary for concrete experience. Quote 56. In the mere continuum, there are contrary potentialities. In the actual world, there are definite atomic actualities determining one coherent system of real divisions throughout the region of actuality. In the extensive continuum, there exist conflicting possibilities or potentialities, but in the actual world, these possibilities are resolved into definite atomic actualities. These actual entities determine how the continuum is divided, creating a coherent and organized structure out of what was merely potential. Thus, quote 57, thus, the continuum is present in each actual entity, and each actual entity pervades the continuum. Whitehead emphasizes the deep interconnection between actual entities and the extensive continuum. Each actual entity contains the potentiality of the continuum within it, and conversely, the continuum is present in every entity. This relationship illustrates the dual nature of existence, where potentiality and actuality coexist and interact. Quote 58. Extension is the most general scheme of real potentiality, providing the background for all other organic relations. Extension, in Whitehead's view, represents the most fundamental level of potentiality, forming the basis for all other relationships between entities. It allows for the combination and integration of objects into unified experiences, serving as the backdrop for more specific spatial and temporal arrangements. Quote 59. In respect to time, this atomization takes the special form of the epochal theory of time. Time, according to Whitehead, is atomized in discrete moments or epochs, rather than flowing continuously. This epochal theory of time suggests that time consists of individual segments of becoming, rather than a smooth, uninterrupted flow, each of which is a distinct moment of experience or becoming. Quote 60. The philosophy of organism is an attempt, with the minimum of critical adjustment, to return to the conceptions of the vulgar. Whitehead describes his philosophy of organism as an effort to reconnect with the common-sense understanding of the world, which sees reality as composed of actual entities or sensible objects. By stripping away complex metaphysical systems, the philosophy of organism aligns more closely with how ordinary people perceive reality, emphasizing a direct connection to actual entities. Quote 61. The extensive continuum is that general relational element in experience whereby the actual entities experienced and that unit experience itself are united in the solidarity of one common world. The extensive continuum is a fundamental framework that unites all actual entities and experiences, creating a shared reality. It serves as the relational background through which individual entities connect and interact, forming the unified experience of a common world. Quote 62. The actual entities atomize it, and thereby make real what was antecedently merely potential. Actual entities break down the potentiality of the extensive continuum into distinct, real events or occurrences. Before this atomization by actual entities, the continuum exists only as potential, but through the process of becoming, actuality emerges from this potentiality. Thus, quote 63, an actual entity never moves. It is where it is and what it is. Whitehead asserts that an actual entity does not undergo motion or change in the traditional sense. Each actual entity is fully determined by its location and its being, meaning that it remains fixed and unchangeable in its identity throughout its existence. Quote 64. The fundamental meaning of the notion of change is the difference between actual occasions comprised in some determinate event. Change, according to Whitehead, is not something that happens to individual entities, but rather refers to the differences between successive actual occasions within a specific event. Change arises from the transitions between distinct occasions rather than within a single entity. Quote 65. An actual entity never changes, and that it is the outcome of whatever can be ascribed to it in the way of quality or relationship. Once an actual entity is complete, it does not change. Its qualities and relationships are fixed, and the entity's identity is defined entirely by what it has experienced and how it relates to other entities. Change occurs between entities, not within them. Quote 66. This error does not consist in the employment of the word substance, but in the employment of the notion of an actual entity which is characterized by essential qualities, and remains numerically one amidst the changes of accidental relations and of accidental qualities. Whitehead critiques the traditional metaphysical notion of substance as something that retains its identity, despite changing accidental qualities or relations. He rejects the idea that an actual entity can remain numerically identical while undergoing change, emphasizing that each entity is complete and unchanging. Quote 67. The organic theory is closer to Descartes than to Newton. Also, it is close to Spinoza. But Spinoza bases his philosophy upon the monistic substance, of which the actual occasions are inferior modes. The philosophy of organism inverts this point of view. Whitehead explains that his philosophy aligns more closely with Descartes and Spinoza than with Newton. However, while Spinoza bases his philosophy on a single substance, with actual occasions as its modes, Whitehead's philosophy of organism reverses this by prioritizing individual actual occasions over any singular, monistic substance. Quote 68. The body, however, is only a peculiarly intimate bit of the world. Just as Descartes said, "This body is mine." So he should have said, "This actual world is mine." Whitehead reflects on Descartes' statement that "this body is mine," and expands it, suggesting that the entire actual world is intimately connected to the self. In the philosophy of organism, each individual's experience arises from their possession of the world around them, extending beyond just the body. Locke's quote 69 notion of time hits the mark better. Time is perpetually perishing. In the organic philosophy, an actual entity has perished when it is complete. Whitehead praises Locke's understanding of time as something that is continuously passing away. In his own philosophy, an actual entity perishes as soon as it completes its process of becoming, though it remains in existence as part of the past, contributing to the ongoing process of the world. Quote 70. No actual entity can rise beyond what the actual world as a datum from its standpoint, its actual world, allows it to be. This quote emphasizes that each actual entity is limited by the conditions and data provided by its actual world. The possibilities of what an entity can become are shaped by the givenness of the world it emerges from, making the entity's potential fundamentally tied to its context. Quote 71. Each totality of givenness attains its measure of order. There is not just one ideal order which all actual entities should attain and fail to attain. Whitehead argues that order is not a universal standard applied to all entities, but rather a condition that emerges uniquely for each entity based on the specific givenness of its world. Each entity achieves its own form of order, which may differ from others, depending on the components it interacts with. Quote 72. The notion of one ideal arises from the disastrous over-moralization of thought under the influence of fanaticism, or pedantry. Here, Whitehead criticizes the idea of a singular, ideal order as a product of overzealous or rigid thinking. He suggests that imposing a single standard of order ignores the diversity of actual entities, each of which follows its own path toward satisfaction based on its unique circumstances. Quote 73. The notion of satisfaction is the notion of the entity as concrete, abstracted from the process of concrescence. It is the outcome separated from the process. Satisfaction, in Whitehead's philosophy, refers to the completed state of an entity after its process of becoming, or concrescence, is finished. It is the final concrete outcome that remains once the process itself has ended, marking the completion of the entity's journey. Quote 74. No actual entity can be conscious of its own satisfaction, for such knowledge would be a component in the process, and would thereby alter the satisfaction. An actual entity cannot experience or know its own satisfaction because such awareness would change the very process of its becoming. Once the process is completed, satisfaction exists as a settled fact, and consciousness of it would disrupt that finality. Quote 75. The world is self-creative, and the actual entity as self-creating creature passes into its immortal function of part creator of the transcendent world. Whitehead describes the world as a self-creating process in which each actual entity contributes to the ongoing creativity of the universe. Once an entity completes its process of becoming, it attains a kind of objective immortality, shaping the future world through its influence. Quote 76. This subjective aim is not primarily intellectual. It is the lure for feeling. This lure for feeling is the germ of mind. The subjective aim of an entity, which drives its process of becoming, is rooted in feeling rather than intellect. This drive toward feeling is the foundation of mental operations and serves as the seed from which the mind develops, reflecting the importance of emotion and purpose in the creative process. Quote 77. The relevance of an eternal object in its role of lure is a fact inherent in the data. In this sense, the eternal object is a constituent of the objective lure. Eternal objects serve as potentialities that act as lures for the feelings of an actual entity. These objects are embedded in the data that shape an entity's process of becoming, providing possibilities that the entity can accept or reject as it defines itself. Quote 78. The concrescent process admits a selection from this objective lure into subjective efficiency. This is the subjective ideal of itself which guides the process. During the process of becoming, an actual entity selects from the available potentialities offered by eternal objects, shaping its own subjective experience. This selection forms the entity's ideal of itself, guiding its development and shaping the course of its concrescence. Quote 79. In the case of the primordial actual entity, which is God, there is no past. Thus, the ideal realization of conceptual feeling takes the precedence. For Whitehead, God differs from other actual entities in that he has no past. This means that God's experience is primarily concerned with conceptual feelings, which shape the potentialities for future realities. God's primordial nature is thus directed by eternal objects and their possibilities, rather than by a history of physical prehensions. Quote 80. Our present cosmic epoch is formed by an electromagnetic society, which is a more special society contained within the geometric society. Whitehead explains that the cosmic epoch we currently inhabit is defined by an electromagnetic field, which is a specific, organized system nested within a larger geometric framework. This electromagnetic society governs the physical laws and behaviors observed in the natural world, such as those studied in physics. Quote 81. A structured society as a whole provides a favorable environment for the subordinate societies which it harbors within itself. Whitehead highlights that structured societies consist of smaller, subordinate societies that thrive within the larger framework. The larger structured society offers stability and the necessary conditions for these smaller societies to persist and function, creating a harmonious interaction between different levels of organization. Quote 82. A complex structured society which is stable, provided that the environment exhibits certain features, is said to be specialized in respect to those features. A structured society is specialized when it can maintain stability in an environment that exhibits specific characteristics. Specialization allows the society to function optimally under certain conditions, but this also means that it may struggle or fail to adapt if those conditions change. Quote 83. Thus, the problem for nature is the production of societies which are structured with a high complexity, and which are at the same time unspecialized. In this way, intensity is mated with survival. Whitehead identifies a challenge for nature: to create societies that are both complex, allowing for rich experiences, and flexible enough to survive various environmental changes. Such societies balance the intensity of experience with adaptability, ensuring both richness and longevity. Quote 84. Structured societies in which the second mode of solution has importance are termed living. Living societies, according to Whitehead, are those where the second method of adaptation, introducing novelty in response to changes in the environment, is crucial. In living organisms, this process involves conceptual originality, allowing them to adapt creatively to their surroundings, distinguishing them from inorganic entities. Quote 85. A living society is one which includes some living occasions. Thus, a society may be more or less living, according to the prevalence in it of living occasions. A living society is defined by the presence of living occasions, moments of creativity and originality. The degree to which a society is considered living depends on how many of these living occasions it contains, illustrating a spectrum between more and less living societies. Quote 86. In the case of the higher organisms, this conceptual initiative amounts to thinking about the diverse experiences. In the case of lower organisms, this conceptual initiative merely amounts to thoughtless adjustment of aesthetic emphasis. In higher organisms, the process of adaptation involves active thinking and conscious decision-making. In lower organisms, the same process occurs without thought, as a more automatic response to stimuli, focusing on the harmony of experience without intellectual engagement. Quote 87. Life is a bid for freedom. An enduring entity binds any one of its occasions to the line of its ancestry. Life represents the pursuit of freedom and novelty, while an enduring entity is tied to its past through a series of connected occasions. The challenge of life is to break free from this strict inheritance and introduce originality into the ongoing process of becoming. Quote 88. The primordial appetitions which jointly constitute God's purpose are seeking intensity, and not preservation. Whitehead asserts that God's purpose is to evoke greater intensity of experience, rather than to preserve the existing order. God's creative drive seeks novelty and depth in the unfolding of reality, without being bound by the need to maintain specific past forms. The quote 89. Thus, God's purpose in the creative advance is the evocation of intensities. The evocation of societies is purely subsidiary to this absolute end. God's ultimate goal is to evoke intense experiences and feelings in the process of creation. The formation of societies is secondary to this purpose, serving as a means to achieve deeper, more meaningful experiences within the framework of reality. Quote 90. The presumption that there is only one genus of actual entities constitutes an ideal of cosmological theory to which the philosophy of organism endeavors to conform. Whitehead emphasizes that the philosophy of organism assumes all actual entities, from the lowest to the highest, belong to a single genus. This presumption aims for a unified cosmological understanding, where both God and the most basic occasions are part of the same fundamental structure, though they differ in complexity and function. Quote 91. The character of an organism depends on that of its environment, but the character of an environment is the sum of the characters of the various societies of actual entities which jointly constitute that environment. This quote explains the interdependence between an organism and its environment. The organism's nature is shaped by its surroundings, which consist of various societies of actual entities. These entities provide the order or chaos that influences the organism's development and experience. Quote 92. There is no reason, so far as our knowledge is concerned, to conceive the actual world as purely orderly or as purely chaotic. Whitehead argues that the world contains a mixture of both order and chaos. Complete order or chaos does not exist. Instead, the world includes elements of both, where societies of entities bring order, and other entities contribute to chaos. Quote 93. If there is to be progress beyond limited ideals, the course of history, by way of escape, must venture along the borders of chaos in its substitution of higher for lower types of order. Progress requires taking risks and venturing into the unknown. By approaching the edge of chaos, higher forms of order can replace lower ones, leading to greater depth and complexity in the structure of reality. Quote 94. Triviality arises from lack of coordination in the factors of the datum, so that no feeling arising from one factor is reinforced by any feeling arising from another factor. Whitehead defines triviality as the result of a disorganized datum where the various components do not enhance or intensify one another. In such cases, the experience lacks depth, as there is no coordination between the elements to produce a meaningful or intense feeling. Quote 95. Vagueness is due to excessive identification. In the datum, the objectifications of various actual entities are replicas with faint coordinations of perspective contrast. Vagueness occurs when different entities are too similar, and their distinctions are faint. The lack of contrast between them leads to an experience where the differences between entities are irrelevant, resulting in a vague, indistinct perception of the whole. Quote 96. Harmony requires the due coordination of chaos, vagueness, narrowness, and width. Harmony, for Whitehead, is the balance of contrasting elements. It is not achieved through order alone, but through the careful coordination of chaos, vagueness, and opposing characteristics, like narrowness and width. True harmony involves the integration of these different forces. Quote 97. The philosophy of organism aspires to construct a critique of pure feeling, in the philosophical position in which Kant put his critique of pure reason. Whitehead's philosophy aims to build a new foundation focused on feeling rather than pure reason. He suggests that feeling is the fundamental basis of experience, and a philosophy based on it can replace Kant's rational-based approach, offering a more comprehensive understanding of reality. Quote 98. The experience of the simplest grade of actual entity is to be conceived as the unoriginative response to the datum with its simple content of sensa. The simplest entities respond passively to their environment without introducing new, original elements. Their experience is shaped by basic sensations, sensa, and they lack the capacity for complex or creative reactions to the data they receive. Quote 99. The general principles of physics are exactly what we should expect as a specific exemplification of the metaphysics required by the philosophy of organism. Whitehead believes that the principles of modern physics are a concrete example of the metaphysical framework laid out by the philosophy of organism. He suggests that scientific laws align with and support the broader metaphysical ideas of interconnectedness and process found in his philosophy. Quote 100. Perception, in this primary sense, is perception of the settled world in the past as constituted by its feeling tones and as efficacious by reason of those feeling tones. Whitehead is explaining that primary perception is rooted in the experience of past events, which are transmitted through their feeling tones. These feelings shape how we perceive the world, emphasizing that perception is not just a passive reception, but an active process where past influences are carried forward into present experience. Quote 101. Philosophers have disdained the information about the universe obtained through their visceral feelings, and have concentrated on visual feelings. Here, Whitehead criticizes traditional philosophy for overlooking visceral bodily sensations and focusing predominantly on visual perception. He argues that the information gained from bodily feelings is just as important in understanding the universe, suggesting that philosophy has been too narrowly focused. Quote 102. Perception, which merely, by means of a sensum, rescues from vagueness a contemporary spatial region, in respect to its spatial shape and its spatial perspective from the percipient, will be called perception in the mode of presentational immediacy. Whitehead defines presentational immediacy as the type of perception that uses a sensum, like color, to clarify the spatial characteristics of a particular region. This form of perception is focused on the immediate present and the spatial relations of objects, but it does not engage with their deeper, causal aspects. Quote 103. The unraveling of the complex interplay between the two modes of perception, causal efficacy and presentational immediacy, is one main problem of the theory of perception. Whitehead identifies one of the key challenges in understanding perception, disentangling the interaction between causal efficacy, which deals with past influences and feelings, and presentational immediacy, which focuses on the immediate sensory experience. The two modes are interconnected, but need to be distinguished for a complete theory of perception. Quote 104. Such symbolic reference is so habitual in human experience that great care is required to distinguish the two modes. Whitehead points out that symbolic reference, the blending of causal efficacy and presentational immediacy, is so ingrained in our experience that it becomes difficult to separate them. This habitual intertwining of the two modes requires careful analysis to fully understand how perception operates. Quote 105. Presentational immediacy illustrates the contemporary world in respect to its potentiality for extensive subdivision into atomic actualities and in respect to the scheme of perspective relationships which thereby eventuates. In presentational immediacy, Whitehead suggests that what we perceive visually and through other senses is not the actual division of the world into discrete units, but its potential for such subdivision. It allows us to see the relationships and perspectives that would emerge if the world were broken down into smaller parts. Quote 106. A complete region, satisfying the principle of concrescent unison, will be called a duration. A duration is a cross-section of the universe. It is the immediate present condition of the world at some epoch. Whitehead introduces the concept of duration as a cross-section of the universe at a given moment, where all the entities within that duration are in a state of unified becoming. This duration represents a snapshot of the universe's ongoing process, capturing the present condition of reality. Quote 107. We thus gain the conception of a locus in which any two atomic actualities are in concrescent unison, and which is particularized by the fact that M belongs to it. Whitehead explains how the concept of concrescent unison creates a locus, or a space, where all atomic actualities share a unified process of becoming. This locus is defined by the presence of a particular actual entity, M, showing how the universe is interconnected through shared moments of becoming. Quote 108. The term duration will be used for a locus of unison of becoming, and the terms presented locus and strain locus for the systematic locus involved in presentational immediacy. Whitehead clarifies his terminology by stating that duration refers to a space where all entities share a unified process of becoming, while presented locus and strain locus describe the systematic relations we experience in presentational immediacy. These terms help to differentiate between the ways entities are related in time and space. Quote 109. We are governed by stubborn fact. Whitehead asserts that our experiences and actions are ultimately constrained by the stubborn fact of reality. Despite our creative and novel possibilities, we are always influenced by the unchangeable facts of our past and environment, which limit and shape what we can become. Quote 110. Nothing is ever really present with the mind but its perceptions or impressions and ideas, and that external objects become known to us only by those perceptions they occasion. Hume's statement highlights his view that the mind is directly aware only of perceptions, impressions, and ideas. External objects are not directly perceived. Rather, we know them only through the perceptions they evoke in the mind, indicating a divide between reality and our mental representation of it. Quote 111. All our simple ideas in their first appearance are derived from simple impressions, which are correspondent to them and which they exactly represent. Hume argues that every simple idea originates from a corresponding simple impression, meaning that ideas are mental copies of sensory experiences. This relationship between impressions and ideas forms the foundation of Hume's empiricism, where all knowledge stems from sensory input. Quote 112. Repetition is capable of more or less. The more often impressions are repeated, the more proper it is that ideas should copy them. Hume suggests that the more frequently an impression is experienced, the more likely it is for the mind to generate a corresponding idea. This connection between repetition and the formation of ideas reflects Hume's focus on experience as the basis of knowledge, with repetition reinforcing the association between ideas. Quote 113. It is a great mistake to attribute to Hume any disbelief in the importance of the notion of cause and effect. Throughout the treatise, he steadily affirms its fundamental importance. Although Hume is often associated with skepticism about causality, Whitehead emphasizes that Hume recognized the importance of the concept. Hume's issue was not with the significance of cause and effect, but with the challenge of justifying it through empirical impressions alone, leading to his exploration of habit and expectation. Quote 114. Freedom, givenness, potentiality are notions which presuppose each other and limit each other. Whitehead asserts that concepts like freedom, givenness, and potentiality are interdependent and mutually restrictive. They define each other's limits, as freedom is shaped by the conditions, givenness, and possibilities, potentiality, available to an entity in its process of becoming. Quote 115. Experience involves a becoming. That becoming means that something becomes, and that what becomes involves repetition transformed into novel immediacy. Whitehead describes experience as a dynamic process of becoming, where each new occurrence repeats elements from the past but transforms them into something new and immediate. This continuous cycle of repetition and novelty is central to the philosophy of organism. Quote 116. Hume's impressions are self-contained, and he can find no temporal relationship other than mere serial order. Whitehead critiques Hume's view of impressions as isolated and unrelated in time, except for their sequence. This contrasts with Whitehead's own philosophy, which emphasizes the interconnectedness of temporal events and the influence of the past on the present. Quote 117. The doctrine of objectification is an endeavor to express how what is settled in actuality is repeated under limitations, so as to be given for immediacy. Whitehead's doctrine of objectification explains how past events are repeated in the present, but under certain constraints. These past events become part of the immediate experience of actual entities, showing how the past is continuously involved in the present through repetition. Quote 118. We prehend other actual entities more primitively by direct mediation of emotional tone, and only secondarily and waveringly by direct mediation of sense. Whitehead argues that our most fundamental way of experiencing other entities is through emotional tone, rather than through sensory perception. Sensory experiences are secondary and less reliable compared to the direct emotional responses that connect us to the world. Quote 119. The merit of Hume's account is that the process described is within the soul. In the philosophy of organism, the soul, as it appears in Hume, and the mind, as it appears in Locke and Hume, are replaced by the phrases the actual entity and the actual occasion, these phrases being synonymous. Whitehead acknowledges the value in Hume's account of mental processes, but replaces the concepts of soul and mind with actual entity and actual occasion. In the philosophy of organism, these terms better capture the dynamic process of experience and becoming that defines reality. Quote 120. The organic philosophy interprets experience as meaning the self-enjoyment of being one among many, and of being one arising out of the composition of many. Whitehead explains that, in the philosophy of organism, experience is understood as the individual's self-realization within a network of relationships. Each individual entity finds its identity through its connection to and composition from many other entities, highlighting the relational and processual nature of existence. Quote 121. Locke explicitly discards metaphysics. His inquiry has a limited scope. This therefore being my purpose, to inquire into the original, certainty, and extent of human knowledge. Whitehead notes that Locke deliberately avoids deep metaphysical questions and focuses instead on understanding the nature and limits of human knowledge. By narrowing his investigation to human cognition, Locke avoids engaging with broader metaphysical theories about existence and reality. Quote 122. For the philosophy of organism, the percipient occasion is its own standard of actuality. In Whitehead's philosophy, each moment of experience, or percipient occasion, is self-determining. The reality of other entities is known only in relation to how they contribute to the experience of the perceiving entity, making each occasion of perception the ultimate measure of what is real. Quote 123. Locke's avoidance of metaphysics only led him up to a stage of thought, for which metaphysics is essential to clarity. Whitehead critiques Locke for his avoidance of metaphysics, suggesting that while Locke made significant contributions to philosophy, his failure to address fundamental metaphysical issues ultimately limited his insights. Whitehead believes that deeper metaphysical inquiry is necessary to fully understand the nature of reality. Quote 124. Hume clipped his explanation by this a priori theory, which he states explicitly in the first quotation made from his treatise. Whitehead points out that Hume limited his philosophical investigation by adhering to a pre-existing theory of sensation. This theoretical framework, which emphasizes that knowledge comes solely from sensory impressions, constrained Hume's exploration of other aspects of experience and reality. Quote 125. The principle of relativity is the axiom by which the ontological principle is rescued from issuing in an extreme monism. Whitehead introduces the principle of relativity as a safeguard against the idea that everything in the universe is just one indistinguishable whole. The principle ensures that while everything is interconnected, each entity maintains its own distinctiveness, preserving diversity within the unity of existence. Quote 126. The definite ingression into a particular actual entity is not to be conceived as the sheer evocation of that eternal object from not being into being. It is the evocation of determination out of indetermination. Whitehead describes how an eternal object, a potential form, becomes actual in a particular entity. This process is not about creating something from nothing, but rather about transforming an indeterminate potential into a definite realized form within an actual entity. Quote 127. Process is the growth and attainment of a final end. The progressive definition of the final end is the efficacious condition for its attainment. In Whitehead's view, the process of becoming is goal-oriented. Each actual entity is guided by an evolving sense of purpose, and the gradual definition of this purpose drives the entity toward its completion or satisfaction. The process and the final end are interlinked, with the end shaping the process. Quote 128. The thinker is the final end whereby there is the thought. In this inversion, we have the final contrast between a philosophy of substance and a philosophy of organism. Whitehead contrasts his philosophy of organism with the traditional philosophy of substance. In the former, thought is not generated by a pre-existing thinker. Instead, the process of thinking creates the thinker. This inversion places the focus on becoming rather than static being, emphasizing process over substance. Quote 129. The organic philosophy denies this doctrine because, first, it is contrary to naive experience. Secondly, memory is a very special instance of an antecedent act of experience becoming a datum of intuition for another act of experience. Whitehead argues against the idea that knowledge of the world arises solely from private sensations. Instead, he asserts that memory and experience provide direct access to reality, where one act of experience becomes part of the next. This view aligns with the philosophy of organism, which rejects the separation of mind and world. Quote 130. The subjectivist principle is that the datum in the act of experience can be adequately analyzed purely in terms of universals. Whitehead explains the subjectivist principle, which asserts that the contents of experience can be fully understood by analyzing them as universals, abstract qualities detached from the actual world. This principle underpins much of modern philosophy, but Whitehead questions its adequacy for capturing the complexity of experience. Quote 131. The philosophy of organism denies the premises on which this distinction is founded. Whitehead's philosophy of organism rejects the traditional division between universals and particulars. Instead, it proposes that actual entities, what are typically called particulars, and eternal objects, what are typically called universals, should be understood in a new way, emphasizing their interconnected roles in the process of becoming. Quote 132. Descartes' notion of an unessential experience of the external world is entirely alien to the organic philosophy. Whitehead criticizes Descartes' view that our experience of the external world is secondary or unessential. In contrast, the philosophy of organism insists that experiences of other entities are fundamental to our own existence, and our perception of the world is deeply connected to how we come to be. Quote 133. It is only by the introduction of covert inconsistencies into the subjectivist principle, as here stated, that there can be any escape from what Santayana calls solipsism of the present moment. Whitehead argues that adhering strictly to the subjectivist principle leads to solipsism, the idea that only one's own mind is sure to exist. To avoid this, philosophers often introduce hidden inconsistencies, but Whitehead advocates for a more honest rejection of the principle in favor of a more relational view of experience. Quote 134. The enjoyment of experience be the constitutive subjective fact. These categories have lost all claim to any fundamental character in metaphysics. In Whitehead's view, if we take the enjoyment of experience as the central fact of metaphysics, then traditional categories like substance and quality lose their foundational status. Experience itself, rather than static categories, becomes the key to understanding reality. Quote 135. Hume describes impressions of sensation in the exact terms in which the philosophy of organism describes conceptual feelings. Whitehead highlights that Hume's descriptions of sensory impressions closely resemble how the philosophy of organism describes conceptual feelings. These are specific feelings of universals, but Whitehead critiques Hume for failing to recognize the relational aspects of these experiences. Quote 136. The philosophy of organism keeps this stone as gray in the datum for the experience in question. Unlike Hume, who reduces the experience of a gray stone to a sensation of grayness in the mind, Whitehead's philosophy of organism retains the full experience, including the stone itself, as part of the datum of experience. This maintains the connection between the experiencing subject and the world. Quote 137. Consciousness is the subjective form involved in feeling the contrast between the theory, which may be erroneous, and the fact which is given. Whitehead explains that consciousness arises from the feeling of contrast between an imagined possibility, theory, and the reality of what is actually experienced. This contrast is foundational to judgment and thought, allowing us to differentiate between what might be and what actually is. Quote 138. The primitive form of physical experience is emotional, blind emotion, received as felt elsewhere in another occasion and conformally appropriated as a subjective passion. Whitehead asserts that the most basic form of experience is emotional, a direct feeling or passion that is inherited from other occasions. This blind emotion forms the foundation of experience before any conscious thought or interpretation takes place. Quote 139. Process is the admission of eternal objects in their new role of investing the datum with the individuality of the subject. In Whitehead's philosophy, the process of becoming involves eternal objects, pure potentials, taking on a new role in shaping the experience of an individual subject. The subject's individuality emerges as these eternal objects are integrated into its experience, creating a unique and specific reality. Quote 140. The pure mode of presentational immediacy gives no information as to the past or the future. It merely presents an illustrated portion of the presented duration. Whitehead explains that presentational immediacy, which is the direct sensory perception of the present moment, does not provide insight into the past or future. It only gives a snapshot of the present, illustrating the portion of time that is being experienced at that moment without connecting it to the broader temporal context. Quote 141. The first principle, explanatory of symbolic reference, is that for such reference, a common ground is required. Symbolic reference, the process of interpreting one type of perception through another, requires a shared basis, or common ground. This means that certain elements must be recognized as identical between different modes of perception, enabling the mind to link them together into a unified experience. Quote 142. In respect to bodily perceptions, the two modes achieve the maximum of symbolic reference and pool their feelings referent to identical regions. When it comes to perceptions related to the body, the two primary modes of perception, causal efficacy and presentational immediacy, are most effectively integrated. These perceptions combine to create a more complete and unified understanding of bodily sensations, as they refer to the same physical regions. Quote 143. What is directly perceived, certainly and without shadow of doubt, is a gray region of the presented locus. Any further interpretation, instinctive or by intellectual judgment, must be put down to symbolic reference. In perception, we directly experience simple sensory data, such as a gray area within our field of vision. Any further understanding or identification, like recognizing the gray object as a stone, is the result of symbolic reference, where additional layers of meaning are attached to the basic sensory experience. Quote 144. The two modes express the same datum under different proportions of relevance. Whitehead emphasizes that both modes of perception, causal efficacy and presentational immediacy, deal with the same underlying reality but highlight different aspects of it. Each mode assigns different levels of importance to various elements, creating complementary perspectives on the same experience. Quote 145. Consciousness is the feeling of causality. In the perception of the stone as not gray, such feeling is in full development. Whitehead explains that consciousness involves a sense of causality, especially when something deviates from expectations, like perceiving a stone that is not gray when it is expected to be. In such cases, consciousness is more fully engaged, as it has to process the contrast between what is anticipated and what is actually perceived. Quote 146. The separation of the potential extensive scheme into past and future lies with the mode of causal efficacy and not with that of presentational immediacy. The distinction between past and future is a function of causal efficacy, not of presentational immediacy. Causal efficacy deals with the flow of time, the way past events influence the present, whereas presentational immediacy is focused purely on the present moment, without concern for temporal direction. Quote 147. The philosophy of organism does not admit its truth, and thus rejects the touchstone, which is the Neolithic weapon of critical philosophy. Whitehead rejects the dominant philosophical assumption, inherited from thinkers like Hume and Kant, that presentational immediacy is the primary source of perception. His philosophy of organism challenges this view, arguing that causal efficacy is equally, if not more, fundamental in shaping our experience of the world. Quote 148. The notion of causation arose because mankind lives amid experiences in the mode of causal efficacy. Whitehead asserts that the idea of causation emerges from our constant experience of the world through causal efficacy. This mode of perception is rooted in the way we feel the influence of past events on the present, making causality a natural and primary element of human experience, not a theoretical construct. Present. Quote 149. Presentational immediacy is the enhancement of the importance of relationships which were already in the datum, vaguely and with slight relevance. Whitehead explains that presentational immediacy sharpens and clarifies relationships within the sensory data that are already present but initially vague. Through this mode, certain aspects of the experience, like colors and shapes, become more distinct and relevant, allowing us to engage with the present moment more clearly. Quote 150. It is quite untrue that the feelings of various types of influences are dependent upon the familiarity of well-marked sensa in immediate presentment. Whitehead points out that our feelings of influence, such as the sense of a causal presence, are not dependent on clear, familiar sensory data. Even in the absence of distinct sensory input, like in darkness or silence, we still experience vague feelings of influence from the world around us, highlighting the significance of causal efficacy over sensory immediacy. Quote 151. Our bodily experience is primarily an experience of the dependence of presentational immediacy upon causal efficacy. Whitehead explains that our awareness of the body is deeply tied to understanding how sensory perceptions rely on the underlying causal forces acting on our body. For instance, we associate the sensations from our hand or eyes with the causal influence they exert, which reverses Hume's view by making causal efficacy foundational rather than dependent on sensory data. Quote 152. There is every indication of a vague feeling of causal relationship with the external world, of some intensity, vaguely defined as to quality, and with some vague definition as to locality. Whitehead observes that even in lower organisms, such as jellyfish or plants, there is evidence of a primitive, vague feeling of causal connection to the world around them. This basic awareness of the causal nexus demonstrates that perception, even at its most rudimentary level, involves a sense of influence from the environment. Quote 153. The inorganic occasions are merely what the causal past allows them to be. Whitehead explains that in the inorganic realm, entities do not exhibit the same level of creativity or originality as living organisms. They are fully determined by their past causes and respond only to the influence of these past events, without introducing any new elements or responses. Quote 154. The philosophy of organism attributes feeling throughout the actual world. In Whitehead's metaphysics, feeling is not restricted to conscious beings. It is a fundamental element that exists throughout all actual entities, even in the inorganic world. This doctrine reflects the idea that all entities, no matter how simple or complex, participate in the process of experiencing and responding to the world. Present. Quote 155. Presentational immediacy is an outgrowth from the complex datum implanted by causal efficacy. Whitehead explains that the clear, distinct sensory experience we enjoy in presentational immediacy is a later development, growing out of the more basic, vague data provided by causal efficacy. Presentational immediacy refines and sharpens the information we receive from the world, but it is built upon the foundation of causal feelings. Quote 156. The third grade is to be identified with occasions in which presentational immediacy has assumed some enhanced precision. Whitehead describes a stage in the hierarchy of perception where organisms begin to develop greater precision in their sensory experiences. This enhanced precision allows for more effective symbolic transference, helping organisms better respond to their environment and navigate their needs, particularly those related to survival. Quote 157. We are subject to our percepta in the mode of efficacy. We adjust our percepta in the mode of immediacy. Whitehead contrasts the modes of perception, explaining that while we are passive recipients of influences in the mode of causal efficacy, in presentational immediacy we have more control. We can adjust our sensory experiences to suit our needs and desires in the present moment, creating a balance between being influenced by the past and actively shaping our immediate environment. Quote 158. The two modes are unified by a blind symbolic reference by which supplemental feelings derived from the intensive but vague mode of efficacy are precipitated upon the distinct regions illustrated in the mode of immediacy. Whitehead explains how symbolic reference works, where vague feelings from causal efficacy are connected to clear sensory experiences in presentational immediacy. This process unifies the two modes of perception, enhancing and intensifying our experience by linking the vague with the distinct, allowing us to perceive the world more holistically. Quote 159. A living occasion is characterized by a flash of novelty among the appetitions of its mental pole. Whitehead explains that every living occasion or moment of experience is marked by a sudden introduction of something new in the mental aspect of the entity. These appetitions or desires introduce novelty into the entity's becoming, driving it forward through the creative process. Quote 160. The existence of imaginative literature should have warned logicians that their narrow doctrine is absurd. Whitehead critiques logicians for their narrow focus on propositions solely as subjects of truth or falsehood judgments. He points out that imaginative literature demonstrates that propositions serve a broader function, such as eliciting feelings, emotions, and aesthetic experiences beyond mere logical analysis. Quote 161. The lure for feeling is the final cause guiding the concrescence of feelings. The process of becoming for an actual entity is guided by what Whitehead calls the lure for feeling. This is the driving force that pulls together various elements of experience into a unified whole, aiming for the final satisfaction of feeling. It is this lure that shapes the evolution of the entity's experience. Quote 162. A proposition is a hybrid between pure potentialities and actualities. Whitehead defines a proposition as a unique entity that combines both pure potentialities, eternal objects, and actualities. Propositions introduce potential relationships into the actual world, representing possibilities that may or may not be realized depending on how they are integrated into the process of becoming. Quote 163. A proposition is realized by a member of its locus when it is admitted into feeling. Propositions come to life when they are incorporated into the experience of an actual entity. This happens when the proposition is felt by the entity, rather than simply being an abstract possibility. In this way, propositions gain reality through their integration into the ongoing process of experience. Quote 164. When a non-conformal proposition is admitted into feeling, the reaction to the datum has resulted in the synthesis of fact with the alternative potentiality of the complex predicate. Whitehead explains that when a non-conforming proposition, one that introduces something new rather than aligning with existing facts, is integrated into an entity's experience, it results in the creation of something novel. This synthesis introduces a new possibility into the world, transforming the entity's experience and potentially altering reality. Quote 165. A proposition is entertained when it is admitted into feeling. Horror, relief, purpose are primarily feelings involving the entertainment of propositions. Whitehead describes how propositions are more than intellectual constructs. They are felt experiences. Emotions such as horror, relief, and purpose arise when a proposition is entertained by an entity, showing that propositions are deeply intertwined with emotional and subjective experiences. Quote 166. The primary element in the lure for feeling is the subject's prehension of the primordial nature of God. In Whitehead's metaphysics, the ultimate drive toward novelty and feeling, the lure for feeling, is rooted in the subject's connection to the primordial nature of God. This prehension, grasping, of divine potentiality serves as the foundation for the entity's experience of new possibilities and the ongoing creative advance of the world. Quote 167. In every judgment, the universe is ranged in a hierarchy of wider and wider societies. Whitehead points out that every judgment made by an entity occurs within a broader context of interconnected entities, or societies. These societies are part of a hierarchical structure, where each judgment influences and is influenced by the wider universe, reflecting the interconnectedness of all things in the process of becoming. Quote 168. A proposition is the potentiality of the objectification of certain presupposed actual entities via certain qualities and relations. Whitehead describes a proposition as a potential relationship between certain actual entities and the qualities or relations they may possess. Propositions act as a bridge between eternal objects, pure potentials, and actual entities, offering possible ways in which these potentials could manifest in reality. Quote 169. The proposition constitutes a lure for a member of its locus by reason of the germinateness of the complex predicate to the logical subjects. Whitehead explains that a proposition attracts an entity to it, like a lure, by offering a potential realization that is relevant or appropriate to the entity's context. This potential, called the complex predicate, engages the actual entities, the logical subjects, by offering them possibilities for their development. Quote 170. A proposition shares in the concrete particularity of actual occasions, and in the abstract generality of eternal objects. A proposition occupies a unique space between the concrete world of actual events and the abstract realm of eternal objects. It combines elements of both worlds, being tied to particular actual occasions, while also embodying the general potentialities of eternal objects, thus serving as a mediator between the two. Quote 171. Error is the price which we pay for progress. Whitehead emphasizes that mistakes and errors are necessary for the advancement of thought and reality. Introducing new possibilities or propositions may lead to errors, but these errors are a vital part of the creative process that allows for growth and the emergence of novel realities. Quote 172. We ask the metaphysical question, what is there in the nature of things, whereby an inductive inference, or a judgment of general truth, can be significantly termed correct or incorrect? Whitehead reflects on the challenge of determining what makes an inductive inference or a general judgment correct or incorrect. He is probing the underlying metaphysical basis that allows us to make judgments about truth in the world, especially when these judgments involve extrapolation from limited evidence. Quote 173. All judgment is categorical. It concerns a proposition true or false in its application to the actual occasion, which is the subject making the judgment. Judgments, for Whitehead, are always categorical, meaning they involve a definite affirmation of whether a proposition is true or false, as it applies to a specific situation. Each judgment is based on the actual experience of the entity making it, and it directly concerns the reality it perceives. Quote 174. In the philosophy of organism, an actual occasion is the whole universe in process of attainment of a particular satisfaction. Whitehead describes each actual occasion as a moment in which the entire universe is involved in the process of achieving a particular satisfaction. Every actual occasion reflects the universe's effort to realize a specific set of relationships and experiences, encapsulating the whole in each instance. Quote 175. Probability is always relative to evidence. So, on the statistical theory, the numerical probability will mean the numerical ratio of favorable to unfavorable cases in the particular class of cases selected as the ground for statistical comparison. Whitehead discusses the nature of probability, explaining that it is always based on the available evidence. In statistical theory, probability is calculated by comparing favorable and unfavorable cases within a defined set, but this calculation depends on the selection of a suitable ground for comparison. Quote 176. The concept of God's functions in the world is at least as urgent a requisite of thought as is the secularization of other elements in experience. Whitehead argues for a more secular understanding of God's role in the universe, suggesting that just as other elements of experience have been secularized, so too should our concept of God's function be treated in a non-religious philosophical context. This shift in perspective allows for a broader, more inclusive view of God's relationship to the world. Quote 177. In every inductive judgment, there is therefore contained a presupposition of the maintenance of the general order of the immediate environment. Whitehead explains that all inductive judgments rest on an assumption that the general order of the environment will remain consistent. This presupposition is crucial for making inferences about the future based on past experiences, as it assumes continuity in the laws governing the environment and its entities. Quote 178. That all things flow is the first vague generalization which the unsystematized, barely analyzed intuition of men has produced. Whitehead emphasizes that the idea of constant change and flux is one of the earliest and most intuitive insights humans have had about reality. This notion of all things flow has appeared in various cultures and philosophies throughout history, suggesting that it is a fundamental observation about the nature of existence. Quote 179. The elucidation of meaning involved in the phrase "all things flow" is one chief task of metaphysics. For Whitehead, understanding the deep meaning behind the idea that everything is in a state of flux is a central task of metaphysical inquiry. This involves exploring the nature of change, the entities involved in that change, and how they relate to the whole of existence, making it a core concern of philosophical thought. Quote 180. There are two kinds of fluency. One kind is the concrescence, which, in Locke's language, is the real internal constitution of a particular existent. The other kind is the transition from particular existent to particular existent. Whitehead distinguishes between two types of fluency: concrescence, which is the process by which an entity comes into being and forms its internal constitution, and transition, which is the movement from one entity to another. Both types of fluency are necessary for understanding how change and continuity operate in the universe. Quote 181. Concrescence moves towards its final cause, which is its subjective aim. Transition is the vehicle of the efficient cause, which is the immortal past. Concrescence is directed by the subjective aim of the entity, the purpose that drives its becoming, while transition carries the influence of past entities into the present. This dual process shows how both internal motivation and external causation shape the development of actual entities. Quote 182. Each actual occasion defines its own actual world from which it originates. No two occasions can have identical actual worlds. Whitehead highlights that every actual occasion or moment of experience is shaped by its own unique perspective of the world. Since no two occasions share exactly the same context, each creates a distinct world for itself based on its experiences and influences. Quote 183. An actual occasion is analyzable. The analysis discloses operations transforming entities which are individually alien into components of a complex which is concretely one. Whitehead explains that an actual occasion can be broken down into a series of processes that transform disparate, unrelated entities into a unified whole. This transformation is central to the way individual entities come together to form a cohesive, interconnected reality. Quote 184. The satisfaction is the culmination of the concrescence into a completely determinate matter of fact. The satisfaction of an actual occasion is the final stage in its process of becoming, where all possibilities are resolved into a concrete reality. At this point, the entity achieves its full realization, and its process of development comes to an end. Quote 185. No entity can be divorced from the notion of creativity. An entity is at least a particular form capable of infusing its own particularity into creativity. Whitehead argues that creativity is intrinsic to every entity. Each entity is not only a result of creative processes, but also contributes its own unique qualities to the ongoing creative advance of the universe, ensuring that creativity is a fundamental aspect of all existence. Quote 186. The future is merely real, without being actual, whereas the past is a nexus of actualities. In Whitehead's view, the future exists only as a realm of potentiality, not yet actualized, while the past consists of completed actualities. The present moment, or concrescence, bridges the gap between the two by transforming the potentiality of the future into the concrete reality of the past. Quote 187. Each actual entity, although complete so far as concerns its microscopic process, is yet incomplete by reason of its objective inclusion of the macroscopic process. Whitehead explains that while an actual entity may be complete in its own internal process, it remains part of a larger, ongoing macroscopic process. This means that every entity is simultaneously finished in one sense, but also part of a broader, unfinished cosmic evolution, reflecting the continuous nature of the universe. Quote 188. The philosophy of organism is a cell theory of actuality. Each ultimate unit of fact is a cell complex, not analyzable into components with equivalent completeness of actuality. Whitehead describes the philosophy of organism as viewing the universe in terms of cell complexes, where each actual entity is like a cell, a fundamental unit of experience. These cells are indivisible in their actuality, meaning they cannot be broken down into simpler, equally complete components. This reflects how every actual entity functions as a complete process of becoming. Quote 189. Each process of appropriation of a particular element is termed apprehension. In Whitehead's framework, prehension refers to the way an actual entity incorporates or appropriates elements from the universe into its own being. These elements can include other actual entities or eternal objects, and the process of prehension allows an entity to take these external elements and make them part of its internal constitution. Quote 190. An actual entity is a process in the course of which many operations with incomplete subjective unity terminate in a completed unity of operation, termed the satisfaction. Every actual entity undergoes a process where initially fragmented and incomplete feelings or experiences are integrated into a final unified experience called the satisfaction. This completion represents the entity's fully realized state, where all its potentialities and influences have been consolidated into a coherent whole. Quote 191. The satisfaction of each actual entity is an element in the givenness of the universe. It limits boundless, abstract possibility into the particular real potentiality from which each novel concrescence originates. Once an actual entity reaches satisfaction, it becomes part of the universe's given reality, shaping future possibilities. Satisfaction limits the infinite possibilities that exist and turns them into concrete realities that serve as starting points for future actual entities to build upon in their own processes of becoming. Quote 192. A feeling is in all respects determinate, with a determinate subject, determinate initial data, determinate negative prehensions, a determinate objective datum, and a determinate subjective form. Whitehead explains that every feeling or prehension is a fully defined process. It has a subject, the entity experiencing it, initial data, what is being felt, negative prehensions, elements excluded from the feeling, an objective datum, what is being felt, and a subjective form, how the feeling is experienced. These elements together form a complete, determinate experience. Quote 193. An actual entity feels as it does feel in order to be the actual entity which it is. Whitehead emphasizes that the feelings or prehensions of an actual entity are not arbitrary. They are purposeful and necessary for the entity to become what it is. The process of feeling shapes the entity's identity and existence, showing that each entity's experience is essential to its final form. Quote 194. The universe is thus a creative advance into novelty. Whitehead describes the universe as constantly advancing, with every new actual entity contributing something novel to existence. This ongoing creative process ensures that reality is not static, but continually evolving, with each entity introducing new possibilities and actualities into the world. Quote 195. The attainment of a peculiar definiteness is the final cause which animates a particular process, and its attainment halts its process, so that by transcendence it passes into its objective immortality as a new objective condition added to the riches of definiteness attainable. Whitehead explains that each process of becoming has the goal of achieving a unique, specific state of existence. Once this state is reached, the process stops, and the entity gains objective immortality. meaning that it continues to exist in the world as a stable, defined fact that influences future processes. Quote 196. A feeling bears on itself the scars of its birth. It recollects as a subjective emotion its struggle for existence. It retains the impress of what it might have been, but is not. Whitehead poetically describes how every feeling or experience within an actual entity carries the memory of the challenges and choices that shaped it. The entity's final state includes traces of the possibilities that were rejected, reflecting the complexity and struggle inherent in the process of becoming. Quote 197. The actual cannot be reduced to mere matter of fact in divorce from the potential. Whitehead argues that actual reality cannot be understood as isolated facts separate from potentialities. The actual world is always in relation to the possibilities that shaped it and continues to be influenced by what could have been, showing that actuality and potentiality are deeply intertwined. Quote 198. The process of integration, which lies at the very heart of the concrescence, is the urge imposed on the concrescent unity of that universe by the three categories of subjective unity, of objective identity, and of objective diversity. Whitehead explains that the process of concrescence, or the formation of an actual entity, is driven by the need to integrate various elements under the three key principles: subjective unity, objective identity, and objective diversity. These categories ensure that each actual entity is unified, maintains its self-identity, and incorporates diverse elements into its final form. Quote 199. The synthesis in its completeness expresses the joint particularities of that pair of relata and can relate no others. Whitehead highlights that in a synthesis, such as a contrast between two elements, the resulting relationship is unique to those particular elements. This relationship cannot be generalized to other elements or entities, reinforcing the individuality of each relational synthesis in the universe. Quote 200. A multiple contrast cannot be conceived as a mere disjunction of dual contrasts. It is one contrast, over and above its component contrasts. A multiple contrast, which involves more than two elements, is not simply the sum of individual dual contrasts. Instead, it forms a unified contrast that is greater than the individual relationships it contains, reflecting Whitehead's belief in the emergent qualities of complex unities. Quote 201. This consciousness takes the form of our consciousness of particular spatial and temporal relations between things directly perceived. Whitehead explains that our perception of space and time is not merely conceptual, but is rooted in our direct physical feelings of particular relations between actual entities. These relations form the basis of our awareness of the world's structure and the connections between objects. Quote 202. Our perceptual feelings feel particular existence. That is to say, a physical feeling, belonging to the percipient, feels the nexus between two other actualities, A and B. In this quote, Whitehead emphasizes that perceptual feelings are not abstract or universal. They are tied to specific actual entities and the relationships between them. When we perceive something, we are feeling the connection between two or more actualities in the world. Quote 203. The multiple nexus is how those actual entities are really together in all subsequent unifications of the universe, by reason of the objective immortality of their real mutual prehensions of each other. Whitehead describes how a nexus of actual entities continues to exist in future unifications of the universe, thanks to the objective immortality of their prehensions, or relationships. This means that once entities have interacted, their connections remain part of the fabric of reality, influencing future processes. Quote 204. The universe is always one, since there is no surveying it except from an actual entity which unifies it. Also, the universe is always new, since the immediate actual entity is the superject of feelings which are essentially novelties. Whitehead explains that the universe is both unified and continually new. Each actual entity, through its feelings, unifies the universe in its experience, and because these feelings are always novel, each entity contributes something new to the universe, ensuring its constant evolution. Quote 205. The subjective form is the immediate novelty. It is how that subject is feeling that objective datum. Whitehead defines the subjective form as the unique way in which an entity experiences its objective datum, the external world. This form represents the novelty of each entity's perspective, showing how it uniquely feels and interprets the data it encounters. Quote 206. In the process of the concrescence, feelings of an earlier phase sink into the components of some more complex feeling of a later phase. As an entity moves through the process of becoming, its earlier feelings are absorbed and integrated into more complex feelings. This ongoing synthesis creates a richer, more developed experience, leading to the final satisfaction of the entity. Quote 207. No feeling can be abstracted either from its data or its subject. It is essentially a feeling aiming at that subject, and motivated by that aim. Whitehead asserts that feelings are inseparable from both the data they incorporate and the subject experiencing them. Each feeling is directed toward a specific aim, shaping the subject in the process and contributing to the entity's final form. Quote 208. A simple physical feeling entertained in one subject is a feeling for which the initial datum is another single actual entity, and the objective datum is another feeling entertained by the latter actual entity. Whitehead explains that a simple physical feeling involves two actual entities, the subject of the feeling and the initial datum, which is another actual entity. The objective datum of the simple feeling is a feeling experienced by the initial datum, illustrating how feelings are connected between entities in a relational process. Quote 209. A simple physical feeling is an act of causation. The actual entity, which is the initial datum, is the cause. The simple physical feeling is the effect, and the subject entertaining the simple physical feeling is the actual entity conditioned by the effect. Whitehead describes simple physical feelings as causal acts. The initial datum, the first entity, serves as the cause, while the feeling produced in the subject, the second entity, is the effect. This dynamic shows how feelings transfer influence from one entity to another, shaping their development. Quote 210. A simple physical feeling is the most primitive type of an act of perception, devoid of consciousness. Whitehead identifies simple physical feelings as the foundational acts of perception that do not involve conscious awareness. These basic, unconscious perceptions allow entities to interact with and perceive the world without the need for higher cognitive processes. Quote 211. The cause passes on its feeling to be reproduced by the new subject as its own, and yet as inseparable from the cause. There is a flow of feeling. Whitehead highlights how feelings transfer from one entity to another, with the original feeling being reproduced in the new subject. This flow of feeling links the cause and effect, ensuring continuity while allowing the new subject to experience the feeling as its own. Quote 2-12. This passage of the cause into the effect is the cumulative character of time. The irreversibility of time depends on this character. Time is understood as cumulative because the transfer of feelings from cause to effect creates a chain of influence that cannot be reversed. Each feeling adds to the flow of time, making it a continuous, forward-moving process. Quote 213. In a simple feeling, there is a double particularity in reference to the actual world, the particular cause and the particular effect. Whitehead notes that each simple physical feeling is specific to both the cause and the effect. This particularity reflects how feelings are tied to distinct entities and their interactions, emphasizing the unique connections formed between them. Quote 214. Physical feelings embody the reproductive character of nature, and also the objective immortality of the past. Whitehead explains that physical feelings preserve and reproduce past experiences, allowing them to influence the present. This reproduction ensures that the past continues to exist within the present, providing a form of objective immortality through the transfer of feelings. Quote 215. A conceptual feeling is feeling an eternal object in the primary metaphysical character of being an object, that is to say, feeling its capacity for being a realized determinant of process. Whitehead introduces conceptual feelings as the experience of eternal objects, which are pure potentials. These feelings recognize the capacity of eternal objects to influence the development of an actual entity, determining how these potentials will be realized in the process of becoming. Quote 216. Evaluation has three characteristics. It determines in what status the eternal object has ingression into the integrated nexus physically felt, values up or down its importance, and is dependent on other feelings in its phase of origination. Valuation, in Whitehead's philosophy, is a process that shapes how eternal objects influence actual entities. It determines how the object integrates into the entity's experience, assigns relative importance, and is influenced by other feelings within the entity's concrescence. Quote 217. Consciousness arises when a synthetic feeling integrates physical and conceptual feelings. Whitehead asserts that consciousness emerges when physical and conceptual feelings are synthesized within an entity. This integration of feelings is necessary for conscious awareness, allowing the entity to reflect on its experiences in a more complex and structured way. Quote 218. According to the ontological principle, there is nothing which floats into the world from nowhere. Everything in the actual world is referable to some actual entity. Whitehead asserts that every event or feeling in the world must have a source or origin in a pre-existing actual entity. This reflects the ontological principle, where nothing arises independently or without a connection to prior entities or experiences. Quote 219. The subject completes itself during the process of concrescence by a self-criticism of its own incomplete phases. Each actual entity evolves toward completion by reflecting on its own becoming. The process of concrescence, or the formation of the entity, involves a self-assessment where the entity integrates and refines its experiences and feelings, striving for coherence. Quote 220. God and the actual world jointly constitute the character of the creativity for the initial phase of the novel concrescence. Whitehead explains that both God and the existing actual world contribute to shaping the initial phase of a new actual entity. God provides the potential aims, while the world offers the conditions, and together they guide the creative process of becoming for each new entity. Quote 221. In a hybrid physical feeling, the actual entity forming the datum is objectified by one of its own conceptual feelings. Hybrid physical feelings involve a blend of physical and conceptual prehensions. Here, an actual entity is objectified not just through a physical feeling, but also through its own conceptual valuation, adding a layer of complexity to how it is experienced by other entities. Quote 222. The disastrous separation of body and mind, characteristic of philosophical systems derived from Cartesianism, is avoided in the philosophy of organism by the doctrines of hybrid physical feelings and of the transmuted feelings. Whitehead critiques Cartesian dualism, which separates mind and body, and explains that his philosophy of organism overcomes this division. Through the concepts of hybrid and transmuted feelings, physical and mental aspects of experience are integrated, showing that they are inseparable. Quote 223. Transmutation is the way in which the actual world is felt as a community, and is so felt in virtue of its prevalent order. Whitehead describes transmutation as the process by which an actual entity experiences the world as a unified whole, recognizing the shared order and commonalities among various entities. This transformation of individual feelings into a cohesive experience enables entities to perceive the world as interconnected. Quote 224. Consciousness requires that the objective datum should involve a qualified negative determined to some definite situation. For consciousness to arise, the objective data, what is being perceived, must include a contrast between affirmation and negation, allowing the entity to recognize what is and what is not. This contrast forms the basis for conscious awareness and judgment. Quote 225. A conceptual feeling with its valuation has primarily the character of purpose, since it is the agent whereby the decision is made as to the causal efficacy of its subject. Conceptual feelings are purposeful in nature. They guide the decision-making process within an entity, determining how it will influence future experiences and relationships. These valuations shape how an entity will act as a causal force in the ongoing flow of reality. Quote 226. The ultimate creative purpose, that each unification shall achieve some maximum depth of intensity of feeling, subject to the conditions of its concrescence. Whitehead explains that the goal of each actual entity is to reach the deepest possible intensity of feeling within the constraints of its development. This creative drive toward maximal experience and intensity reflects the core aim of the universe's process of becoming. Quote 227. A propositional feeling is a feeling whose objective datum is a proposition. Whitehead introduces the concept of propositional feelings, which are feelings based on propositions rather than direct experiences or perceptions. These propositions are potentialities, not yet confirmed as true or false, and they serve as the focus of the feeling. Quote 228. A proposition must be true or false. Herein, a proposition differs from an eternal object, for no eternal object is ever true or false. Whitehead explains the distinction between propositions and eternal objects. While eternal objects exist as pure possibilities without being judged as true or false, propositions can be evaluated in terms of truth or falsehood because they are tied to specific actual entities and their potential relationships. Quote 229. A proposition enters into experience as the entity forming the datum of a complex feeling derived from the integration of a physical feeling with a conceptual feeling. Propositions come into play through the integration of physical and conceptual feelings. They act as the bridge between the actual world and the realm of possibilities, offering potential outcomes based on the interaction of these feelings, thus enriching experience. Quote 230. In the proposition, the eternal object, in respect to its possibilities as a determinant of nexus, is restricted to these logical subjects. Whitehead describes how propositions restrict eternal objects to specific entities or logical subjects within a particular context. In this way, propositions give eternal objects a defined role within a specific relational framework, limiting their otherwise boundless potential. Quote 231. In every proposition, as such, and without going beyond it, there is complete indeterminateness so far as concerns its own realization in a propositional feeling, and as regards its own truth. Propositions remain indeterminate in their truth or realization until they are engaged with by an actual entity. Until this interaction takes place, propositions exist only as potentialities, without a definitive status of being true or false. Quote 232. But in the real world, it is more important that a proposition be interesting than that it be true. Whitehead argues that the value of a proposition lies not solely in its truth, but in its capacity to be engaging or stimulating. Interesting propositions drive creativity and development, even when they may not be factually accurate, highlighting the dynamic role of imagination in shaping reality. Quote 233. A propositional feeling can arise only in a late phase of the process of the prehending subject. Whitehead explains that propositional feelings emerge later in the process of an entity's becoming. They rely on the earlier integration of physical and conceptual feelings, which lay the groundwork for the more complex consideration of propositions and their potential truths. Quote 234. A propositional feeling is a lure to creative emergence in the transcendent future. Propositional feelings act as a guide for creative evolution. By presenting possibilities and potential outcomes, they draw the subject toward new developments and transformations, playing a crucial role in the ongoing process of becoming. Quote 235. Imaginative feelings belong to the general case, when the indicative feeling and the physical recognition differ. Imaginative feelings arise when there is a disconnect between what is indicated by the physical feeling and what is recognized conceptually. This difference creates space for imagination to play a role, generating novel propositions and creative possibilities. Quote 236. In the pursuit of truth, even physical feelings must be criticized, since their evidence is not final, apart from an analysis of their origination. Whitehead emphasizes that even direct physical perceptions need critical evaluation. The accuracy of physical feelings is not guaranteed without understanding their origins and how they were integrated into experience, reflecting the complex and uncertain nature of knowledge. Quote 237. Comparative feelings are the result of integrations not yet considered. Their data are generic contrasts. Whitehead introduces comparative feelings as a more complex form of feelings derived from contrasts between different elements. These contrasts serve as the data for the integration of feelings, leading to new and more sophisticated experiences. Quote 238. A feeling is termed a belief, or is said to include an element of belief, when its datum is a proposition, and its subjective form includes, as the defining element in its emotional pattern, a certain form or eternal object associated with some gradation of intensity. Whitehead explains that belief arises when the content of a feeling is based on a proposition, and the emotional intensity of that feeling is shaped by a specific eternal object. This belief is a key part of how propositions are emotionally experienced and evaluated. Quote 239. Conscious perception is the feeling of what is relevant to immediate fact, in contrast with its potential irrelevance. Conscious perception, according to Whitehead, involves discerning what is immediately relevant to a situation, as well as recognizing what might be irrelevant. This contrast between relevance and irrelevance is a central aspect of how we consciously engage with the world. Quote 240. The integration of the two factors into the conscious perception thus confronts the nexus as fact, with the potentiality derived from itself, limited to itself, and exemplified in itself. Whitehead describes how conscious perception emerges from the integration of physical and propositional feelings. This integration allows the entity to confront the nexus, the interconnected reality of actual entities, as a fact, while also recognizing the potentialities that arise from within the nexus. Quote 241. There are therefore two immediate guarantees of the correctness of a conscious perception. One is Hume's test of force and vivacity, and the other is the illumination by consciousness of the various feelings involved in the process. Whitehead acknowledges two ways to verify the correctness of a conscious perception: Hume's test of vividness, which judges the strength and clarity of an impression, and the reflective awareness provided by consciousness, which allows for the inspection of the feelings involved in perception. Quote 242. The term judgment refers to three species among the comparative feelings with which we are concerned. In each of these feelings, the datum is the generic contrast between an objectified nexus and a proposition whose logical subjects make up the nexus. Whitehead explains that judgment arises from comparative feelings that involve a contrast between an objectified reality, the nexus, and a proposition related to that reality. These judgments can take various forms, depending on how the subject evaluates the truth or falsehood of the proposition. Quote 243. Truth is the absence of incompatibility or of any material contrast in the patterns of the nexus, and of the proposition in their generic contrast. For Whitehead, truth occurs when there is no contradiction or incompatibility between the actual state of the nexus and the proposition being evaluated. The coherence between reality and potentiality ensures the proposition's truth. Quote 244. An intuitive judgment is the comparative feeling with its datum constituted by the generic contrast between the nexus involved in the indicative feeling and the proposition involved in the imaginative feeling. Whitehead describes intuitive judgment as a type of comparative feeling where the subject compares the nexus, physical reality, and the proposition, potentiality. This comparison allows the subject to evaluate whether the proposition aligns with or contradicts the nexus. Quote 245. The main function of intellectual feelings is neither belief, nor disbelief, nor even suspension of judgment. The main function of these feelings is to heighten the emotional intensity accompanying the valuations in the conceptual feelings involved. Whitehead explains that intellectual feelings primarily serve to enhance the emotional intensity of an experience, particularly in relation to the valuation of propositions. These feelings increase the importance of certain possibilities, guiding the subject's creative decisions. Quote 246. An intense experience is an aesthetic fact, and its categorical conditions are to be generalized from aesthetic laws in particular arts. Whitehead connects intense experiences to aesthetic principles, suggesting that the conditions governing how we experience intensity are similar to those found in art. Intensity, for Whitehead, follows aesthetic laws, reinforcing the idea that creativity and feeling are deeply tied to the beauty and harmony of experience. Quote 247. There are two distinct ways of dividing the satisfaction of an actual entity into component feelings, genetically and coordinately. Whitehead explains that an actual entity's satisfaction or completion can be analyzed in two ways, genetically and coordinately. Genetic division looks at how the entity develops and integrates its feelings through phases of becoming, while coordinate division examines the entity's final state and its relationship to the larger physical world. Quote 248. Physical time expresses the reflection of genetic divisibility into coordinate divisibility. Whitehead connects physical time to the transition from genetic to coordinate division. While genetic division looks at the process of becoming within an entity, physical time appears when we view the entity's completion, or satisfaction, and how it fits into the wider world. Quote 249. The concrescence presupposes its basic region, and not the region its concrescence. Each actual entity presupposes the spatial and temporal region it occupies during its process of becoming, concrescence. The region does not depend on the entity, but the entity requires this region to actualize its potential and interact with the world. Quote 250. The actual world is atomic, but, in some senses, it is indefinitely divisible. Whitehead asserts that while the actual world is made up of atomic, indivisible entities, it can also be seen as indefinitely divisible depending on the context. This reflects the dual nature of reality, where entities are discrete but can be conceptually divided into parts. Quote 251. An actual entity, in its character of being a physical occasion, is an act of blind perceptivity of the other physical occasions of the actual world. Whitehead describes how actual entities, in their role as physical occasions, blindly perceive and react to other physical entities in the world. This perception does not involve conscious awareness, but is a basic form of interaction between entities. Quote 252. The philosophy of organism holds that the primary relationship of physical occasions is extensive connection. In Whitehead's philosophy of organism, the fundamental relationship between entities is their extensive connection. This connection refers to the spatial and temporal relationships that bind entities together in a larger network, shaping how they interact and influence each other. Quote 253. The actual entity passes into its objective immortality, in virtue of which efficient causation is constituted. Once an actual entity reaches satisfaction, it enters a state of objective immortality. This means that, although it no longer evolves, it continues to exist as part of the causal fabric of the universe, influencing other entities through efficient causation. Quote 254. An actual entity considered in reference to the privacy of things is a subject. Namely, it is a moment of the genesis of self-enjoyment. Whitehead highlights that when viewed from the perspective of privacy, an actual entity is a subject, engaged in its own process of becoming. This self-enjoyment is the entity's internal experience of its own existence, shaping its identity as it integrates feelings and experiences. Quote 255. Eternal objects have the same dual reference. An eternal object considered in reference to the publicity of things is a universal. Considered in reference to privacy, it is a quality or characteristic. Whitehead explains that eternal objects, like actual entities, have both public and private aspects. Publicly, they function as universals, shaping relationships between entities, while privately, they appear as specific qualities or characteristics within the subjective experiences of entities. Quote 256. The theory of prehensions is founded upon the doctrine that there are no concrete facts which are merely public or merely private. Whitehead's theory of prehensions rejects the strict division between public and private facts. Every prehension, an act of experience or feeling, has both a public side, its relationship to other entities, and a private side, the subjective form of the entity experiencing it, emphasizing the interconnectedness of all experience. Quote 257. Two regions are mediately connected when they are both connected with a third region. Whitehead defines mediate connection as occurring when two regions, or entities, are indirectly linked through a third one. This relationship is central to understanding how entities and regions interact within the broader structure of extensive connection. Quote 258. No region is connected with all the other regions, and any two regions are mediately connected. Here, Whitehead asserts that while no single region is directly connected with all others, any two regions can still be indirectly connected through other regions. This highlights the complexity of relationships within the physical world, where everything is interconnected through layers of mediating entities or regions. Quote 259. A region is called an intersect of two overlapping regions, when it is included in both regions and no other region can overlap it without being included in it. Whitehead describes the concept of an intersect as a region shared by two overlapping regions. This intersect is unique in that it cannot be further divided or overlapped by another region, representing a precise point of connection between two entities. Quote 260. A geometrical element is a complete group of abstractive sets equivalent to each other, and not equivalent to any abstractive set outside the group. Whitehead defines a geometrical element as a set of related abstractive sets, which are groups of regions or points converging toward each other. These sets are unique within their group, but they do not relate to sets outside of it. This definition helps establish the structure of space in terms of convergence and equivalence. Quote 261. A point is said to be situated in a region when the region is a member of one of the punctual abstractive sets which compose that point. Whitehead explains that a point's position is determined by its relationship to the regions that contain it. A point exists within a region if the region belongs to one of the sets that define the point's location, tying the concept of a point directly to the regions surrounding it. Quote 262. The notion of nature as an organic extensive community omits the equally essential point of view that nature is never complete. It is always passing beyond itself. Whitehead emphasizes that while nature can be seen as a cohesive and interconnected whole, it is also constantly evolving. Nature is never static. It is always moving beyond its current state, reflecting the dynamic process of becoming and creativity in the universe. Quote 263. In the theory of extension, the atomicity of actual entities, each with its concrescent privacy, has been entirely eliminated. Whitehead notes that in the theory of extension, the individuality and privacy of each actual entity as a complete, undivided whole are no longer emphasized. Instead, the focus is on how these entities are connected within the broader framework of extensive relations, downplaying their atomic nature. Quote 264. A complete locus is a set of points which compose either all the points situated in a region, all the points situated in the surface of a region, or all the points incident in a geometrical element. Whitehead defines a complete locus as the collection of all points within a specific region, surface, or geometrical element. This idea helps map out how points are organized and connected in space, forming the basis for understanding spatial relationships. Quote 265. The extensive continuum is this specialized ordering of the concrete occasions and of the prehensions into which they are divisible. Whitehead explains that the extensive continuum provides the framework for organizing concrete occasions, events, and the prehensions, feelings, that form them. This continuum is what allows the division and connection of entities, creating an organized structure within the universe's spatial and temporal fabric. Quote 266. The ultimate metaphysical principle is the advance from disjunction to conjunction, creating a novel entity other than the entities given in disjunction. Whitehead explains that the fundamental process of reality involves bringing together disparate entities, disjunction, to form a new, unified entity, conjunction. This process generates novelty, as the newly formed entity is different from any of the individual parts that came before it. Quote 267. The actual world is an interrelated structure of the actual entities, each with its own peculiar constitution of internal relations. Whitehead describes the actual world as a complex web of interconnected entities, each of which has its own internal relationships that define its unique character. These internal relations determine how each entity interacts with others, creating a structured yet dynamic universe. Quote 268. Each occasion presupposes its own actual world, out of which it arises, and its own process of concrescence, by which it becomes what it is. Every actual occasion or moment of experience arises from a specific context, its actual world, and undergoes a process of concrescence, or becoming, through which it develops into a fully realized entity. This highlights the interconnectedness of each entity with its past and the process by which it becomes something new. Quote 269. Extension arises from the relationships between actual entities, and these relationships are expressed in the form of extensive connection. Whitehead explains that extension, the spatial and temporal aspect of reality, is a result of the relationships between actual entities. These relationships form a network of connections, which creates the framework for understanding how entities exist in space and time. Quote 270. The region of each actual entity is a standpoint in the extensive continuum from which the actual entity perceives and interacts with the rest of the world. Each actual entity occupies a specific region in the extensive continuum, and this region serves as its standpoint for perceiving and interacting with other entities. This viewpoint shapes how the entity experiences the world and relates to the entities around it. Quote 271. The physical world is a community of actual entities, bound together by the extensive relationships that give rise to the continuum of space and time. Whitehead emphasizes that the physical world is made up of a community of interconnected entities, whose relationships create the extensive continuum that forms the basis of space and time. These relationships ensure that the world is not a collection of isolated entities, but a cohesive, structured whole. Quote 272. An actual entity is both one and many, as it arises from the many influences of the world and becomes a unified whole in its process of becoming. Whitehead highlights the dual nature of actual entities. Each one is shaped by many external influences, but becomes a singular, unified whole through its process of becoming. This interplay between multiplicity and unity is central to how entities come into being and exist in the world. Quote 273. The extensive continuum is the common ground in which all actual entities participate, and through which they interact with one another. The extensive continuum serves as the shared space in which all actual entities exist and interact. This continuum provides the framework for relationships between entities, allowing them to influence one another and participate in the ongoing process of creation. Quote 274. Creativity is the principle by which the universe advances beyond its current state, as new entities are continuously formed through the process of concrescence. Whitehead identifies creativity as the driving force behind the evolution of the universe. Through the process of concrescence, new entities are constantly being formed, pushing the universe beyond its present state and ensuring the ongoing development of reality. Quote 275. There is nothing in the real world which is merely an inert fact. Every reality is there for feeling. It promotes feeling, and it is felt. Whitehead emphasizes that everything in the real world has the potential to generate feelings or experiences. Nothing is simply a passive or inert fact. Every reality has an active role in being felt and in promoting further feelings, showing the dynamic nature of existence. Quote 276. All origination is private, but what has been thus originated publicly pervades the world. Whitehead explains that while the process of becoming, or origination, starts as a private internal experience for each actual entity, the results of that process affect and are shared with the entire world. This reflects how individual experiences ultimately contribute to the collective reality. Quote 277. A feeling in which the forms exemplified in the datum concern geometrical, straight, and flat loci will be called a strain. Whitehead introduces the concept of strain as a type of feeling that involves geometrical elements, such as straight lines or flat planes. Strains are important for understanding how physical realities, particularly in geometry, manifest as feelings within actual entities. Quote 278. It is obvious that important feelings of strain involve complex processes of concrescence. They are accordingly only to be found in comparatively high-grade actual entities. Whitehead explains that strains are complex and require advanced processes of becoming, concrescence. As a result, they are typically found in higher-level entities, those capable of experiencing more intricate and structured feelings. Present quote 279. Presentational immediacy is our perception of the contemporary world by means of the senses. Whitehead defines presentational immediacy as the immediate perception of the present moment through the senses. This type of perception is the most direct way we experience the contemporary world around us, illustrating how sensory data provides access to reality. Quote 280. The witness of the body is an ever-present, though elusive, element in our perceptions of presentational immediacy. Whitehead highlights the constant but often unnoticed role of the body in shaping our sensory experiences. Our perceptions are always influenced by the bodily context through which we experience the world, though this connection might not always be consciously acknowledged. Quote 281. The feeling of bodily efficacy is more primitive than the feeling of presentational immediacy which issues from it. Bodily efficacy, or the feeling of the body's influence and presence, is a more basic, foundational feeling than the sensory perception that follows it. Whitehead indicates that our perceptions of the world are built upon these more fundamental bodily experiences. Thus, quote 282. Thus, the contemporary world, as felt through the senses, is valued for its own sake, by means of a later conceptual feeling. Whitehead explains that the sensory world is appreciated not just for its immediate sensory qualities, but also through later conceptual reflection. This process of valuing the world happens through feelings that go beyond mere perception, showing the layered nature of experience. Quote 283. Mental and physical operations are incurably intertwined, and both issue into publicity and are derived from publicity. Whitehead asserts that mental and physical experiences are inseparable. Both types of operations influence one another and ultimately become part of the public reality that all entities share, reinforcing the idea that private experiences contribute to the broader world. Quote 284. It is the mark of a high-grade organism to eliminate, by negative prehension, the irrelevant accidents in its environment and to elicit massive attention to every variety of systematic order. Whitehead points out that advanced organisms are characterized by their ability to focus on order and structure, while ignoring irrelevant details through the process of negative prehension. This selective attention allows such organisms to navigate their environments more effectively by emphasizing what is important. Quote 285. A duration is a complete set of actual occasions, such that all the members are mutually contemporary, one with the other. Whitehead defines a duration as a group of actual occasions that exist simultaneously. These occasions share the property of being contemporaneous, and no other actual occasion can be added without disturbing this unity. Quote 286. A strain locus is entirely determined by the experient in question. It extends beyond that experient indefinitely, although defined by geometrical elements entirely within the extensive region, which is the standpoint of the experient. Whitehead explains that a strain locus, a concept connected to presentational immediacy, is shaped by the entity experiencing it. This locus can stretch beyond the entity itself, but remains rooted in the geometrical aspects of the region occupied by the entity. Quote 287. Rest and motion are definable by reference to real strain loci and to potential strain loci. Whitehead points out that both rest and motion can be understood by examining strain loci, whether actual or potential. These loci provide a framework to analyze the position and movement of entities in space. Quote 288. The indifference of presentational immediacy to contemporary actualities in the environment cannot be exaggerated. Whitehead stresses that presentational immediacy, or sensory perception, is relatively indifferent to the specific details of the actualities around the perceiving entity. What is perceived is not strictly tied to the physical nature of contemporary actualities, but shaped by how the entity's brain processes the information. Quote 289. Presentational immediacy is the mode in which vivid feelings of contemporary geometrical relations, with a special emphasis on certain focal regions, enter into experience. Whitehead explains that presentational immediacy introduces vivid feelings into experience, particularly emphasizing geometric relationships and focal regions. This mode of perception highlights specific aspects of the surrounding world in a structured way. Quote 290. The theory of projection explained above requires that the definition of a complete straight line be logically prior to the particular actualities in the extensive environment. In this quote, Whitehead argues that the concept of straight lines in geometric terms must precede any specific physical objects or events. These lines are part of the abstract structure of space that exists before particular entities take form. Quote 291. Physical measurement is now possible. The modern procedure, introduced by Einstein, is a generalization of the method of least action. Whitehead acknowledges that physical measurement, as advanced by Einstein's theory, can now be understood through the principle of least action. This method allows for the precise calculation of physical properties by integrating geometric data. Quote 292. The whole theory of the physical field is the interweaving of the individual peculiarities of actual occasions upon the background of systematic geometry. Whitehead describes how the physical field, or the interaction of forces, depends on both the specific characteristics of actual occasions and the underlying geometric framework. These two aspects work together to shape the physical universe. Quote 293. All exact observation is made by perception in the mode of presentational immediacy. Whitehead asserts that all precise scientific observations are grounded in presentational immediacy, the direct sensory perception of the world. This mode of perception is fundamental for making accurate measurements and observations of the physical universe. Quote 294. The modern doctrine of private psychological fields is the logical result of Hume's doctrine, though it is a result which Hume, as an agent, refused to accept. Whitehead critiques the idea of private psychological fields, noting that this doctrine stems from Hume's philosophy. However, he points out that Hume himself, as a practical thinker, did not fully embrace the implications of his own theory, which leads to a view of perception as entirely private. Quote 295. The chief danger to philosophy is narrowness in the selection of evidence. Whitehead cautions that the greatest threat to philosophical inquiry is the tendency to focus too narrowly on a limited set of evidence. This limitation can result from personal biases, cultural influences, or the dominant ideas of an era, leading to distorted conclusions. Quote 296. Permanence can be snatched only out of flux, and the passing moment can find its adequate intensity only by its submission to permanence. Whitehead highlights the dynamic relationship between permanence and flux. Permanence is drawn from the ever-changing flow of time, and the fleeting moment gains its full intensity by being anchored in something enduring, showing how both concepts depend on one another for meaning. Quote 297. The art of progress is to preserve order amid change, and to preserve change amid order. Whitehead reflects on the balance between stability and innovation. Progress is achieved by maintaining order while embracing change, ensuring that systems evolve without stagnating or collapsing, which is vital for sustained growth in societies and individuals. Quote 298. Life refuses to be embalmed alive. The more prolonged the halt in some unrelieved system of order, the greater the crash of the dead society. Here, Whitehead argues that life is inherently dynamic and cannot thrive in rigid, unchanging systems. Societies that resist change eventually collapse under the weight of their inflexibility, illustrating the necessity of adaptation for survival and vitality. Quote 299. The final percipient route of occasions is perhaps some thread of happenings wandering in empty space amid the interstices of the brain. Whitehead offers a poetic description of perception, suggesting that the final moments of experience are like a delicate thread of events passing through the spaces between brain cells. This imagery emphasizes the subtle and intricate nature of consciousness and perception. Quote 300. The world is thus faced by the paradox that, at least in its higher actualities, it craves for novelty and yet is haunted by terror at the loss of the past. Whitehead observes that while humanity desires new experiences, there is also a fear of losing the familiar past. This paradox reflects the tension between embracing change and holding on to what has been, a central theme in understanding human existence. Quote 301. The ultimate evil in the temporal world is deeper than any specific evil. It lies in the fact that the past fades, that time is a perpetual perishing. Whitehead identifies the fundamental nature of evil as the loss inherent in the passage of time. The fading of the past and the inability to retain full immediacy of what has been is the ultimate source of sorrow in the temporal world, underscoring the transient nature of existence. Quote 302. The evil of the world is that those elements which are translucent so far as transmission is concerned, in themselves are of slight weight, and that those elements with individual weight, by their discord, impose upon vivid immediacy the obligation that it fade into night. Whitehead describes the dual nature of evil. Elements that can easily transmit and harmonize are often trivial, while those that carry significant weight cause discord and disrupt harmony, ultimately leading to the fading of vivid experience into obscurity. Quote 303. God and the world stand over against each other, expressing the final metaphysical truth that appetitive vision and physical enjoyment have equal claim to priority in creation. Whitehead explains the relationship between God and the world as a reflection of the balance between conceptual vision and physical enjoyment. Both aspects are equally important in the process of creation, with each providing a necessary counterpoint to the other. Quote 304. He does not create the world, he saves it. Or, more accurately, he is the poet of the world, with tender patience leading it by his vision of truth, beauty, and goodness. Whitehead portrays God not as a creator in the traditional sense, but as a savior or poet who gently guides the world toward an ideal through the pursuit of truth, beauty, and goodness. This interpretation emphasizes the patient, creative role of God in shaping reality. In Process and Reality, Whitehead explores the dynamic interplay between permanence and flux, emphasizing that progress is achieved by balancing order with change. He warns against philosophical narrowness and stresses that life thrives on novelty but fears the loss of the past. The ultimate evil lies in time's perpetual perishing, where the past fades, yet Whitehead suggests that reality, shaped by both God and the world, continuously advances through creative novelty. God, as a poet and not a creator, saves the world through a vision of truth, beauty, and goodness, while existence unfolds as a complex web of interconnected entities, each influencing and being influenced by others. The relationship between mental and physical operations, the tension between individual and collective experiences, and the need for imaginative and conceptual feelings to guide creativity are central to his metaphysical framework. Throughout, Whitehead emphasizes the importance of novelty, harmony, and the integration of opposites, such as the many and the one, good and evil, freedom and necessity, in the continuous process of becoming that defines reality. Process and Reality stands as a seminal work in modern metaphysical thought, urging us to look beyond the static categorizations that have long dominated philosophy. Whitehead's exploration of creativity and process challenges us to understand reality as a continuous becoming, where the interrelatedness of all entities gives rise to novelty and evolution. His insights not only redefine our view of existence, but also inspire a more connected and holistic perspective on the universe. In a world increasingly characterized by fragmentation, Whitehead's philosophy offers a hopeful vision of unity, creativity, and ever-unfolding possibilities.
Curious to dive into the mind of Alfred North Whitehead? With StudyLab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of process and reality in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.